Today is March 5th, 2025. My name is Jason Higgins. I'm in Blacksburg, Virginia, at the Virginia Tech University Libraries. Joining me for an oral history interview today is
Alicia Christy.
Alicia. Do I have your consent to record this interview?
Yes.
So, just to let you know part of the process, we can pause or stop at any time. You don't have to answer any questions that you don't want to answer. You'll have the opportunity to review this recording and make any necessary changes. Before we get started, I'd like to ask a few brief biographical questions, and these are short answer. Do you recall the dates of your military service?
Yes. June 30th, 1981 to March 3rd, 2003.
Excellent. Did you deploy to a war zone?
No.
Okay. Did you have deployments internationally?
No, but I had an overseas assignment to Germany.
Do you have access to VA services?
I am not enrolled in VA.
I like to ask this question to everyone I interview. Do you have counseling services available to you if you needed them?
Yes, I do. I'm retired military and I'm over 65, so I have both TRICARE and I have Medicare. And the reason I'm not enrolled in VA is I don't have any service-connected conditions and my income is too high to qualify. So that's why I'm not enrolled in VA.
Okay, thank you for that. What I want to do to begin this interview, I want to focus on major policy changes that you've personally experienced as a military service member and a veteran. You've seen a timetable of major events, and because I don't know the details of all of your service history, are there particular ones that are relevant to your life?
Well, I was in the medical corps, so I'm an obstetrician gynecologist. So the policies regarding pregnancy and women's health care um, affected me during my service. And for 7 years, I was with the VA. I was Deputy Director of Reproductive Health with the Office of Women's Health. And so was involved in policy development during that time. So healthcare policies are the policies that affected me the most directly and that affected me the most professionally.
Thank you for your work. In my experience interviewing women veterans, that is a particular need that always has room for improvement, I think. So thank you for your work initiating that and driving those forces for change. With that said, what are some of the greatest changes that you've witnessed or experienced yourself in the military related to women's health?
Well, there are a number, starting with the pregnancy policy. There's been an increase in the number of days of postpartum leave, the number of weeks of postpartum leave, and I think that has been a great benefit. And also more information about guidance regarding services and for the active duty guidance regarding requirements for fitness training and fitness testing. And also, more recently, both within the VA and within DoD, some of the policies regarding not having to use leave to receive medical care. And so, particularly for things like infertility care, like IVF, that's not available everywhere geographically, and the service members can't control where they're stationed. And so they did not have to use leave for those services. Now, what has been rescinded, which I think is a real problem, is many service women, and again, they can't control where they're assigned, do not have access to abortion services, but they rescinded the policy, and so now they have to use their leave to get medical care. And that is not true for other reproductive health services, such as infertility care, if the care they needed is not available where they're located.
And these are recent policy changes
Yes,
since
since the new administration.
So since 2025.
Yes,
then.
and so one of the policies that the VA changed, which I think was really critical and has saved lives, is with the Dobbs decision. The SecVA at that time said this is a safety issue. This is a healthcare issue. If a woman veteran needs a pregnancy termination for medical reasons, they should be able to get that wherever they live. And because the provider should not be put in the situation of, if I don't provide this medical care, this person will die, it was life or health of the mother, not just life of the mother, as it is with DOD.
So just to clarify, you said women veterans. So this is after military service.
After Dobbs, yes.
Oh. So after a woman has left the military.
After a woman has left the military. And what a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't realize until I was actually practicing in VA, is that although the DOD and VA policies in healthcare are similar and often mirror each other, they're not exact. And so for the military, the abortion policy is life of the mother, rape or incest. For the VA, it's life or health of the mother, rape or incest. And so the travel policy for VA covered and for DOD covered abortions has not changed. It's only for those women seeking pregnancy termination that is not covered by DOD or VA.
Seems like that is a very significant difference between life and health.
Yes. And so it really is, as a physician, it really is critical for it to be life and health and not just life. Because for young, healthy people, when it is clear that they won't survive without the care, they're often very close to death. With elderly people, their vital signs, their pulse, their blood pressure will change before death is imminent. With young people, because they have better reserves, it doesn't. And so that decision is one that's very difficult to make. And if you don't make it in time, you can lose the patient. And the example that I sometimes use with people is, if you told a surgeon, if you diagnose appendicitis, but you can't take the appendix out unless they're likely to die, people would consider that to be unacceptable.
In that type of calculus about the health or the status of the fetus, how is that connected? So the life, the safety, the well-being of the mother.
The biggest predictor of whether or not a fetus will survive is if the mother survives. So if the mother dies, the fetus is very likely to die.
Absolutely.
And there has been some legislation proposed which is really barbaric. So for instance, in Ohio, not once but twice, the legislation tried to pass laws that would require gynecologists to put an ectopic pregnancy, a tubal pregnancy, back in the uterus. Not only would that pregnancy not survive, it would jeopardize the health of the woman. And so it's only in the area of reproductive health care that people with no medical training try to impose rules that can result in deaths of women that didn't have to die.
And certainly there are no equivalents to male healthcare, right?
No, there isn't, as was pointed out in a Supreme Court justice hearing.
Right.
And so the other issue with it being life of the mother, not life or health of the mother, is that the case can then be reviewed and someone can say, well, they wouldn't have died, and so therefore we're going to criminally prosecute you. And so that is the problem with a policy that doesn't allow for consideration of health and not just that the woman would die without this care.
In this moment, in this kind of reactionary moment, you've witnessed and experienced extraordinary social change, since Roe v. Wade in the 1970s. And now we're at this moment 50 years later where it seems like that progress has taken back several steps. I like to believe that most of the American public support veterans. What would you want them to understand about the nature of this particular issue?
Well, I'm involved in some advocacy work now that I'm retired. And when I speak to legislators, what I say is if someone is willing to give their life in service to this country, what kind of health care do they deserve? Is it as good as your staff member? Should it be as good as yours? And I think that veterans and active duty service members should have the high quality health care. They should have the best health care. And so that's my position on that, and that's what I advocate for.
Thank you for your advocacy on that. Related to your time in service and your experiences as a veteran, do you have any ideas on how challenges and barriers that women face could be overcome or negated?
Well, what I've come to find out in my advocacy work is how important legislative advocacy is, because the healthcare benefits are determined often by congressional legislation. And active duty service members and also federal employees are prohibited from self-advocacy other than with their elected officials. So what I want people to know is how important advocacy by non-veterans and by civilians and by people who aren't in the military because they're not able to do that themselves. So I think that is an important message to communicate, and also that we can't forget veterans once we've served. And I am outraged that an advisor to the administration would suggest that veterans are not ready to work and to justify firing veterans in federal service and to imply that they are somehow less than or somehow not competent. We're not suckers or losers, and we deserve to have our service recognized and honored, not disparaged.
I completely agree with that. How have veteran services organizations advocated on these causes that you're familiar with, that you've been involved in? Are there veterans organizations that get involved in this particular topic?
There are usually. So, for instance, paralyzed veterans. Oftentimes, universities will have law clinics where the law students will actually advocate for veterans. And I've been to the Hill with some law students. And what they will also do is help veterans navigate the benefits and navigate the VA healthcare system. And a friend of mine, I'm blanking on the title of the organization, but they actually have a nonprofit in addition to the consultation work that she does, Dr. Evelyn Lewis, where they will provide assistance, free assistance with navigating the VA healthcare system.
That's an invaluable
Yeah,
service.
Veterans Health and Wellness, the Veterans Health and Wellness Foundation.
Thank you for shouting them out. I'm an oral historian. I want to know, how did you find this calling? What's your background in? So maybe I'll ask a short answer, and if there's time, we can illuminate on that a bit more. But what is your professional background? How did you get involved in this type of work related specifically to women's healthcare in the military and veterans?
Well, as an OBGYN, I've always been involved, obviously, in women's healthcare as a clinician. But I was chair of the obstetrics and gynecology department at Walter Reed from 1999 to 2002. And I was also consultant to the Army Surgeon General for women's health issues. And so one of the things that we did during that time that I'm personally very proud of, it used to be that prior to deployment, female active duty soldiers, airmen and Marines, would get the pap smears done, and then the abnormal pap smear would catch up with them when they're deployed. Well, the colposcope, which is the instrument that's used to evaluate abnormal pap smears, does not do well in the desert. You can't get sand in it. And so they would have to be medically evacuated back to Germany to have that evaluated. And so every year, active duty service members, they have to do a review of their health records, make sure their immunizations are up to date, et cetera. And I said the pap smear cervical cancer screening needs to be part of that. And so that was incorporated. The other thing they didn't do, and this is way back prior to the first Gulf War, is they didn't pregnancy test before they deployed. Incredible, right? And so a third of the women who were medically evacuated back because they were pregnant before they deployed. And so all you had to do was part of the pre-deployment testing, add a pregnancy test. And I was told, well, that's very personal. I said, you're talking about an organization that watches people urinate. You need to pregnancy test them before they get deployed. And because they're very hard to replace once they're in theater. And so I think that was a great benefit. Another thing that's happened recently within the past, I would say 3 to 5 years, is they have same-day contraception clinics in a lot of locations. And that was started in the Navy, but has been adapted in the other services, not available everywhere, but available in multiple locations. And I think that has been very beneficial.
It seems to me, with the military being historically a very patriarchal culture, organization, institution, if you will, it just reinforces the fact that there should be women at these decision-making places and these tables making those decisions.
And what has also happened recently, which has been beneficial, is more communication between the military and the VA. And so there now is a transition program, it's called TAPS, that helps women transition from the military into VA healthcare. And there are also clinically what's called clinical practice guideline groups. And so there are healthcare providers from the military and healthcare providers from the VA, and they develop guidelines for various different things such as menopause, pregnancy, etc., recognizing that these populations are in some ways different from the civilian population.
It leads me to a question, because you mentioned your experiences from 99 to 2002, but you also have this kind of overarching understanding of these changes. My question is, do you see any correlation between changes related to women's healthcare needs in the military and during wartime?
That's a very interesting question. In preparation for this program this weekend, I was doing some background research, and I think it was actually someone's PhD thesis, and they looked at administrative, military, and personal, familial policies and women. And what's interesting is during times of conflict, when you need to increase the number of active duty service women, that's when you see a lot of the policy changes. And so I'm very concerned currently, one, we're not in a conflict, and two, there's increasing evidence that service is not valued or honored. And so for that reason, I'm not entirely optimistic that there will be a lot of policy implementation that will support active duty service members' health in general and active duty service women specifically.
It's an interesting dynamic for me as a historian of war in society and American history, is that times of war tend to be times of great social change. And then afterwards, those changes sometimes are reversed. And you can think about women workers in the Second World War, and you can think about the experiences of women in the Vietnam War, and et cetera, and et cetera. So it's a very interesting dynamic. Let me look at my questions, because this is such an engaging conversation. I don't want to get too off track with my own interest. So this is a fairly broad one, and it may be your unique position as a gynecologist, OBGYN, that may kind of shape the way you think about this question. But during the military, during your service, how well did the military meet your healthcare needs?
Well, it met my healthcare needs well for the most part, but I'll share a story that illustrates the fact that there can be policies in place and you can have access and it can still be an issue. And I think my situation is unique in that being a healthcare provider, my ability to navigate the system is very different than someone who is 19 and recently joined the military. So the fact that I was able to navigate the system and I'm able to get the services that I need doesn't reflect the entire population. And so I'll use the example of the pregnancy and postpartum policy. And so that policy was in place when I had my son at Madigan Army Medical Center in 1991. And my supervisor, who was a colonel, I was a major, volunteered to be my obstetrician. I didn't ask him. He volunteered to be my obstetrician, and you'll hear in the story why he did that. His nickname was Bottom Fish, so that should give you context. So when I went to him and I said, when I'm operating, I start contracting. He said, operate sitting down. When I got admitted for premature labor, he had secretaries bring charts to my bed to review because I wasn't doing anything. And when I was in labor, I had a temperature to 103. I was started on triple antibiotics. My son was in the intermediate nursery. And he came to my hospital room. I'm hooked up to an IV. He came to my hospital room and said, I told the residents that you would cover my call for me on labor and delivery because you're in the hospital anyway, and ran away. So I went down to labor and delivery with my IV pole and I said, I'm on triple antibiotics. My son is in the intermediate nursery. I am not covering his call. And they said, none of us would be morally bankrupt enough to call you. So there was a policy in place, but if the person responsible for following the policy is your obstetrician and your boss, where do you go to have someone advocate for you? And so I think that's the issue with any policy and the importance of having external advocates that can ensure that the policies are followed when the people who violate the policies are in positions of power over you?
I want to ask this question. Feel free to decline, okay? This same cultural and systemic issue that your story um, addresses reminds me a lot of the incidents of military sexual trauma and how the chain of command oftentimes is enabling of the continuation of that to persist if the perpetrators are not held accountable to military justice. Do you see a connection between that?
Absolutely. And when I was at the VA, um, I was involved with a military sexual trauma program at the Washington, D.C. VA. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but a former Air Force JAG officer gave a presentation, and he talked about the number of cases that were reported, the number of cases that were prosecuted, and then the number of convictions. And it got down to, I want to say it was 3% were actually convicted. And so I think it creates a situation where people are discouraged and in some cases hopeless. And so I think there are a lot of cases that, one, aren't reported, two, aren't prosecuted, which points out in this area as well the importance of having external advocates that are out of the chain of command.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Some of these questions, I realize that your position is quite unique or maybe even exceptional to most or many women veterans' experiences. But I want to, for consistency across the interviews, I want to ask it to you nonetheless. As a veteran, have there been challenges in gaining access to care through the VA or other insurance programs? For example, TRICARE or private insurance?
I have not, but again, my situation is unique. And now I'm a Red Cross volunteer physician at Walter Reed. And so, and my primary care provider is an internal medicine physician that I trained with in residency. So my access to care is very, very different. But I think addressing the question from the perspective of peers, fellow veterans, and also my patients, a common thing that I hear is that many of them have difficulty getting access to specialty and subspecialty care. And I've heard from women veterans that they also have problems getting access to women health care providers. So in the VA, they have multiple models for care, and some of them have women's clinics. And in the women's clinics, they have women's health care providers who are nurse practitioners and family practice physicians and internal medicine physicians who also do some additional training. And because they have self-identified as being interested in being women's health care providers, they offer more women's health care options than, say, someone who doesn't elect to do the additional training and doesn't elect to have 50% or more of their patients be women. But as you can imagine, with a staffing shortage, there often aren't enough women's health care providers for every woman veteran who wants to be seen by a women's health care provider to be seen by one. And on the active duty side, for active duty service women, particularly if they are assigned in a remote area, it may be difficult for them to see a gynecologist or other specialty care. And I think it's also true globally for veterans of both gender and active duty service members of both genders, if they're in remote locations, that access is more limited. And you've probably heard about healthcare deserts. And so that is a challenge globally, but specifically for active duty service members, for female active duty service members, access to gynecologists, and the same for women veterans.
Thinking back to these 19-year-old young women who may not have the knowledge to navigate institutions to the extent that you do, what kind of advice would you give them? What kind of support is in place for them to seek out?
Well, what I tell patients in general is the best thing you can be is an educated consumer. And medical societies have a lot of excellent patient education sites. And so, for instance, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has a women's healthcare site that has excellent FAQs, they have videos, they have all sorts of information. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine has that as well, and I'm sure a number of medical societies have that. So I always recommend to patients be educated about your medical issues, and also I tell them, think about what you want to ask and write it down, because there's a finite amount of time that the provider has, and you want to make sure that you get your most important questions answered.
I think that's great advice for most people seeking healthcare, actually. Thank you for that. You've already answered this question, but for the purpose of consistency again, did you apply for VA services for any service-connected disability?
Now, I looked into it, but I'm one of the few very, very fortunate people that didn't have service-connected conditions. And so my understanding of it is you have to have a disability and to file for service connection in order to be seen in the VA. And so I think I was treated fairly, and I'm very blessed and fortunate to not have a service-connected condition. So it never entered into my mind that I should be able to get services when there are many people who have a far greater need than I do. And as a retiree, I'm also covered by TRICARE. So,
What are some of the common challenges that you've witnessed other women veterans face while applying for service connection?
well, with gynecologic disorders, particularly if it's something that can't be objectively quantified. So, for instance, for service connection, let's say you have fibroids or you have endometriosis or whatever, the level of disability depends on the impact the condition has. And so often, and this is true not just of women veterans or active duty service women, women often aren't hurt. And so because of that, they may not be approved for the service connected condition, or they may be rated at a lower level because the provider who makes the determination didn't hear them or doesn't believe them, or they don't have appropriate documentation. The other thing, getting back to your earlier question about what would you advise a 19-year-old, is that you should make sure that you are knowledgeable about your medical information. And it's important for you to make sure that that's documented in your medical record. So you might make the assumption that the information is there, and then when you try to adjudicate service connection, the information isn't there.
how has the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell affected your position, your advocacy, if at all?
Well, I think in terms of some services, like for instance, fertility services, I think those individuals feel free now to ask for assistance because asking for assistance would have revealed that they are members of the LGBTQ plus community. So I think it's changed in terms of that. An area globally where it's dramatically changed is now because, and this is because of the Marriage Equality Act, in the military, your legal spouse can get medical benefits. And so now same-sex couples, if they're legally married, their spouse can get benefits.
Have there been significant changes that you've witnessed related to gender affirming care, for example?
Well, the VA, at the time that I left, they were looking into expanding services for transgender veterans. I am very pessimistic that that will continue or that even the rights that they previously have will be safeguarded. And I am concerned that members of that community will not be allowed to serve going forward. And I think that's a real tragedy.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. This is a question that I added to this document. A lot of women veterans I've talked with in my career, interviewing women veterans, have expressed feelings of invisibility, sometimes even betrayal. Can you relate to that?
Yes, a funny story. My husband had surgery at Walter Reed, where I had privileges, where I was on staff. And they referred to him as Colonel Christie. And he's a civilian. So it's, that type of thing. So people assume that it's the man who's a veteran. And because of that, it's very important to me in my artwork to honor women who served. And so on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, I did a series of portraits called Faces of the Fallen, Women Proudly Served. Because when people think about service members, they think about men. And particularly if you think about individuals that are killed in combat, you think about men. And I felt very strongly that these stories needed to be told and their faces seen and their sacrifice honored. And so I think that is a big issue globally.
Does that lend itself to you were wearing a hat whenever I met you earlier. Is that one of the reasons why you display your veteranhood very visibly?
I do, because they're going to assume the assumption is you're not a veteran. And so where in certain environments where I feel that's important to have my status as a veteran acknowledged, I will wear outward symbols of that. And the same is true of medicine because they'll often assume you're not a doctor. So I always wear a white coat. And I was covering one weekend, and my white male colleague was wearing jeans. And he said, "You always get dressed up and you always wear a white coat." And I said, "Because as a Black woman, if I didn't, they'd think I was with housekeeping." And I've actually had a patient actually grab my ID badge and say, "Who are you? I haven't seen you before."
Wow. I'm laughing not because it's funny, but that's
Well,
assault.
that's assault. And I said, well, I'm the former chair of this department, and you probably saw a trainee, which is why you don't recognize me.
Did you drop the microphone as you walked out the door?
No.
Could you tell me what the pin on your lapel? Obviously, one's a flag, but
Yeah, it's women veterans.
okay. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going off my script again,
Yeah,
obviously.
and this one is combat boots. And this and the earrings are from a company owned by a woman veteran.
Interesting fact about combat boots in the Vietnam War. A lot of American nurses, they had to fight for that right to put on combat boots in Vietnam.
I did not know that.
Yeah, yeah. And they were because of their uniforms were so strictly. Um, there was such rigid kind of parameters about what they were supposed to wear and how they were supposed to do their hair and their makeup and their heels. It doesn't lend itself well to a combat zone.
No,
So
and it used to be that if you got pregnant, even if regardless of whether you're married or not, you had to be separated from service.
right, right. You've answered this question, but maybe you can give me another example just to reinforce how common this can be for women. Um, were there times when you felt treated differently than your male peers?
Absolutely. When I was active duty, and I was a colonel at the time, and I would frequently get asked to serve on promotion boards because they wanted to have diversity on the boards, and I checked two boxes. And so at this particular promotion board, the major was introducing people around the table, and they said, Colonel so-and-so is here because he's this, and this. And then they came to me and they said that I was there because I was a Black woman. And I said, excuse me, these are my credentials, and this is why I'm here. And so the major was red-faced, but, and I assumed that what he meant was we have to have diversity on the board. And so, but to minimize me by saying I was there because I'm a Black woman and not because I was chair of a department and doubly board certified and had served for 20 years, but my race and my gender was the only reason that I was there.
As if that wasn't a barrier to your being there anyway, you know. Could you talk about a time whenever your identity as a Black woman and that perspective that you bring um, helped advocate or, changed maybe the culture of a group in which you were working?
Well, I think where it is most impacted is I feel like I'm in a position to mentor young women and African American service members. And often I'll get asked the question, well, what was it like to be the only woman or the only African American or the only African American woman? And what I say is, when you're a white male, you're presumed to be competent until you prove yourself competent. When you're a Black woman, you're presumed to be incompetent until you prove yourself competent. And those are very different starting places.
Thank you for sharing that. This is especially true because most women who enlist in the U.S. military today are disproportionately minoritized. So it's important to have women like you at the table.
Well, thank you.
If I haven't said that already.
Thank you.
I don't normally express my opinion so much in an interview. This is your space, but I just want to affirm it.
Well, I wouldn't have felt free to say these things when I was either active duty or with the federal government. So now I'm Alicia Unleashed. So
You jokingly said that before. What does that mean to you? You're Alicia.
I think I can be totally forthright in what I say without concerns about retribution.
Were there times in your experience where that type of fear of retribution led you to censor yourself?
I would say yes, because oftentimes there's a process where you have to be cleared to speak to certain people. They often want to see your comments. And even if it's, say, giving an academic lecture, they often will review your slides, and you have to provide a disclaimer. These are my personal views and do not reflect the views of the Department of Defense or the Army. And so, and the same thing with the federal government. These are my personal views and do not reflect, the federal government. And so you always have to give that disclaimer. And giving that disclaimer, I think you're conscious about not being overly critical. And I don't disparage anybody who is active duty or who is in the federal government who is very cautious, because there is the very real fear of retribution now more than ever. And the reality is, if you're doing good work and because of comments you make, you are no longer able to do that good work, who has really benefited? And so I'll give you an example of, and this was with my father, was in the civilian sector, but the same sort of thing. My father was a dentist, and he took his dental boards in Pennsylvania in the early 50s. And it's an oral exam. They actually have to do dental work on actual patients. And they pulled aside all of the black candidates and they said, "We really like the way you people sing. Can you do a Negro spiritual for us?" before the board. And they did. And when I was young and angry, I used to think, well, why didn't he just refuse to do that? And then I thought, if he had refused to do that, he wouldn't have passed his boards. And so all of the patients that he was able to take care of, his entire career, would have been ended.
It sounds like you think that there's a compromise to be made in these types of situations. What, because I think that we live in such a unforeseen moment in American culture and society, and specifically related to doctors. There are a lot of laws being passed or passed already which seek to punish medical providers for providing the type of care that you seem to advocate for. Um, what advice would you give them about if they're struggling to maintain their values?
Well, what I would say is align yourself with people who can fight for you, and that's medical societies. So, for instance, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they have a governmental affairs office, they have advocacy groups, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, the American Medical Association. And so having them fight on your behalf, I think, is very effective. Also, there are groups. I was very involved with Vote ER, which is a nonpartisan group that is involved in civic engagement in healthcare settings. So, for instance, they register patients to vote. They don't support any particular candidate or policy. They're about getting patients registered and getting patients to vote and getting patients to see the connection between their health care and their vote. And so I think getting involved in that is also a way. So, for instance, in Maryland, my Maryland state senator provided me with an opportunity to be involved in writing some legislation to help protect healthcare providers who provide reproductive health care. Now, Maryland is a very progressive state, But if the federal laws change, providers in Maryland, despite the state law, could potentially be vulnerable for prosecution. And so I think it's important for there to be safeguards, legislative safeguards put into place so that providers can care for their patients without the fear of criminal prosecution. So an example of that is in the VA, if a woman veteran was eligible for a VA-covered abortion because it was life or health of the mother, rape, or incest, and they were getting the care in a VA facility, they could get that care even if they couldn't get it in the community. And so what 17 Republicans attorney generals tried to do was to try and go after their medical licenses. So that even though what they were doing was lawful, and even though there were numerous memos that said if they're providing this care as part of their duties as a VA physician, it's lawful and allowable, they were going to go after their licenses. And so some VA providers would get licenses in multiple states so that if a red state with restrictive laws came after their license, they could still practice. Because in the federal government and in the military, if you have a state license, it doesn't matter which state it's from.
That makes sense. Yeah. You said earlier that you have a sense of pessimism about the current moment. What gives you strength?
Well, what gives me strength is basically looking back. 70 years ago, somebody who looked like me, couldn't be a physician, would be unlikely to be a colonel, certainly couldn't be a department chair. And so when I look at how far we've come and that we've survived that gives me hope. Aligning myself with other people who are hopeful also gives me hope. And I also am a believer, and some cruel evangelicals have given Christianity a bad name, but that also is a source of hope to me. And I had said, someone who tries to prevent someone from being able to have a family by considering a fertilized egg a child, which is not the legal medical definition, that's not Christian, that's cruel. And so my faith gives me hope. Like-minded people give me hope. Looking at the past gives me hope. And one of the things that I've done in retirement, I continue to teach. And so working with young people gives me hope as well.
You're speaking my language. I teach African American history. I'm teaching it now. My students are scared, rightfully so, but I think there are lessons to be learned from people who experienced far worse times than we did, who never gave up hope. Some did give up hope.
Right.
But
And
they
a
fought
recent
anyway.
example is we survived the COVID pandemic despite some terrible policies, despite vaccine conspiracies. And so if we could survive that, then I think we can survive what's coming. There's a cartoon I love where it's a frog and its head is in the neck of a herring or some sort of large bird. And the frog has its hands around the herring's neck and it says, "Never, never give up."
You're giving me flashbacks to middle school. I had a principal who had that, and anytime I got in trouble, I had to go into that office. But
Never, never give up. Winston Churchill, never, never give up.
that stuck with me. Thank you for that. Um, okay. Let me look at my questions because you can tell I'm intrigued by your story and I just want to know more. If you could improve one issue or any issue that related to women in the military or women veterans, what would you change?
I think what I would change would be access to effective advocacy, because I think, and this is true of both genders, it's difficult if the problem is within your chain of command. And so by having external supports and resources, I think that makes everyone's life better, not just women.
Do you have children?
Yes.
Do you have grandchildren?
No, I have a step grandchild
Okay.
or bonus grandchild. That's
Have your children served in the military?
no.
How would how would you feel if they had wanted to, or if your step grandchild decided and came to talk to you about enlisting in the U.S. military?
I think the military, it was a great choice for me. I think it's a great choice for some people. It would not have been a good fit for my son. He went to Swarthmore, in I call him a hippie, but it would not have been a good fit for him. So that I would have had concerns if he wanted to go into the military because I thought it wasn't a good fit. But I do think it is an excellent choice for some people. And where I think it really is extraordinary is for education. So I joined the military to pay for medical school. And this was way back in the late 70s. The average student in my class graduated $100,000 in debt. I had no debt and a stipend. And so it was a really good choice for me. So paying for college, paying for medical school, paying for professional school, I think it's a really good choice. I think it's important to go into it with eyes open depending upon what you do. So going in right after high school, you're not going to have as many choices. You're not going to have the same autonomy that you do, say, as an officer or somebody who is serving because of an education obligation.
Did you have other people in your family before you who had served in the military?
My father served for 4 years in the dental corps.
And you suggested this earlier. He's a black man.
Yes,
Okay. Do you know anything about his service?
I do, and I can share an anecdote about that. He served for 4 years, and one of the places he was stationed was Fort Dix, New Jersey. And so this was again probably in the early 50s, before I was born. And despite the fact that he was an officer, because he was black, he was not allowed to live in officers' quarters. And so he bought a trailer rather than live in segregated housing.
That's powerful. Self-reliance, right? I think a lot of students get surprised by thinking about segregation within the U.S. military post Truman. So after the integration of the armed services, segregation still happened well into the Korean War and certainly into Vietnam too, in some ways, right? So that's important to know. And also, like you said, something really profound earlier. These policy changes are great, but they're only as powerful as the people willing to enforce them. Right. So thank you for sharing that. This has been a very insightful interview for me.
Thank you.
Um, I can't thank you enough for this.
Oh, you're welcome.
This has
It's been
been
a pleasure.
profoundly interesting to me
Thank you.
in many ways. Before I ask my concluding questions, is there anything throughout this interview that you want to talk about that I didn't think to ask, or anything you wanted to go back to?
Not that I can think of now.
Okay. What would you like people to learn about your experiences in the military, your experiences as a doctor, or as a woman veteran?
Well, what I think is most important is for people who have not served or who don't know someone who served is the level of sacrifice that entails. And on 9/11, I was a department chief at Walter Reed, and my former company commander, Lieutenant Colonel Karen Wagner, had recently been assigned to the Pentagon. And she died that day trying to save people from the fire. And that terrible day really brought home to me what it means to serve, what you're willing to do. And so that's why when I advocate on the Hill for veterans and active duty service members, I say, as someone is willing to give their life in service to this country, what kind of health care do they deserve? And I think because such a small percentage of the population now are active duty or know somebody who's active duty, they don't have the same sense of what it means to serve and what the sacrifice is. And that's also why it so enrages me when people disparage veterans and active duty service members.
Well, thank you for your service, for your
Thank you.
sacrifice, and especially for your advocacy. I
Thank
see
you.
that I see the three as interconnected.
Well, I think I have a special obligation to give back because my path was so easy compared to most people. My experience in the military was very good. They paid for medical school. I was always promoted on time. And I have incredible benefits in retirement. And many, many people don't have that experience. So, because I am so blessed, because I am so fortunate, I think I have a special duty to honor and to advocate for those who serve.
Well, I especially admire that you didn't pull up the ladder behind you. This has been a profound pleasure.
Well, thank
Uh,
you for me
uh,
too.
I'm out of questions. I have a lot more, but I think you covered so much in this short amount of time. I would just offer you the opportunity. If you ever want to follow up with me, if you ever want to do a virtual interview, or if you review this interview and there's something that you want to go back and add to,
Okay.
it'd be a profound pleasure for
Well,
me.
thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.